bump into our other match over here. Looks like we have Greg hanging out on.
Rest in Peace is excellent.
Let's see. I'm gonna bring over the.
My guess is it's Hammer.
It looks like Hammer, but I'm gonna go hand them the stream deck for life totals.
All right. So chat, just bear with me while I update things here. Looks like we've got Grixis, Deaths, Shadow on the right. And on the left, I'm guessing we have Azorius, Hammer.
Yeah, that's the first time I've had. That's the first time I had to do the self-endurance to reset.
Yeah. Well, you announced that you were.
All right, looks like Greg is up game here.
I had to. I already had it. Or that was the only way for me to do it because it's already my hand that was out of mana. Yeah. And so like I had to calling it back, which the only way.
All right, got a Sigard as aid from Greg, and a pass turn.
For a second there, I was like.
Looks like we've got 3 2/2 shadows on the field here. So that's a pretty intimidating board presence there.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's a card you never want to draw.
Wow. The 4th Death Shadow enters the fray.
All right, they're all 4/4s now. I mean, Greg could potentially have the infect kill here.
Right. Would have to.
Nope.
Yeah.
Does not.
You'd have to be able to activate the Ink Moth twice and play the Hammer. So I think you need 4 total mana to activate Ink. Like,
yeah.
like you need 4.
You don't need to activate Ink Moth twice.
You do, because it will lose flying when you equip the Hammer.
Correct,
initially.
but you can attack and wait for no blocks.
Sure, but yeah, I mean, Mason's going to block with the Death Shadow that's untapped.
But you can't block an Ink Moth. You wait for Mason to declare no blockers.
All right. Okay. Fair enough.
And yeah, Mason took that one. So 1-1 here.
And headed back to sideboarding. Let's see, Greg's taking a look.
Can't quite tell what he's contemplating here.
So there's a March.
Okay.
So gonna throw 1 March of Otherworldly Light back in the deck.
March seems totally acceptable here. You know, most of Mason's threats are going to be 1 mana. Usually going to be on the Ragavans, some Darcy's, Death Shadow, maybe some Ledger Shredders hanging out in there. So March is going to be able to kill most things in Mason's deck. And then if there's a card, potentially there could be a card that Mason could play that Greg would also want to march, like explosives, although that seems unlikely. But it's kind of a catch-all. Pretty much takes care of anything except for lands and planeswalkers. Unless that lands Urza Saga, because March can take care of that. It's been interesting to see Hammer evolve post Luris ban. Different directions that deck has gone into. Right. Greg checking sideboard here. And a mulligan for Mason. interesting to see two decks that used to play Lurrus now playing against each other post Lurrus.
Yeah, that is odd. Who do you like in this matchup, Travis?
It seems pretty close. I feel like it's very, you know, everything to some extent is play draw dependent in Modern, but this, when you're playing these two pretty aggressive decks, I feel like if Greg is able to have a pretty explosive turn 1 or 2, you know, Mason's interaction is going to be 1 to 2 mana spells. So I think I'm kind of leaning slightly towards Hammer, but I think it's really close. Probably about a 50-50, I would say. What are your thoughts?
I think I like to be on the Death Shadow side. I do think there's a little bit, it's a little bit dependent on something like if Greg is on the play and can get a Sigarda's Aid down before Mason is able to start tearing apart the hand with discard spells. I think that can be big game. You know, obviously Grixis can't really remove enchantments, so I think Sigarda's Aid is pretty big in the matchup. That said, I think the combination of hand disruption plus board disruption of Grixis Death Shadow, in my opinion, gives it just a little bit of an edge.
Looks like there is the engineered explosives that Mason brought in, but we're going down to 5 here. So Mason's on the draw, so mulliganing to 5 isn't the worst thing in the world. It always feels bad when you're on the play and your opponent keeps a hand and then you mulligan to 5, because then you basically gave your opponent an ancestral recall. But right now, Mason's after the card draw, they'll be off in card parity by 1, which isn't the worst thing, especially when you're playing a card. There's probably 1 copy, maybe 2 of Kolaghan's Command between the main deck and the sideboard in these shadow lists these days.
Yeah, especially if it turns out that Greg, for example, doesn't have an Urza Saga hand, and maybe Greg has a bunch of 0 mana artifacts and 1 payoff. And if you can tag that payoff with a discard spell, you can pretty quickly be like outlast the Hammer deck and then start 2-for-1ing with things like Kolaghan's Command and get back into it. Because the card quality of the Hammer deck is low.
Yeah, I feel like Hammer plays a lot like 2017 Affinity, where you have a lot of cards that support your payoff cards, but there's not a huge amount of payoff cards in the deck.
And I actually feel like Greg's hand looks like there's at least 3 lands still in hand. So I think if you're going to win on a mold of 5, your Hammer opponent starting off the game somewhat flooded, I think is pretty good here. No turn 1 play as well for Hammer. But it looks like there is a Stoneforge Mystic in hand for Greg.
So it's probably a hand for Greg that he wasn't excited about, but isn't bad enough to throw back and go down a card.
Interesting, Greg has an Ornithopter in hand, but chose not to run it out. Given that there's no Sigarda's Aid, there's not really any huge reason to run it out because it's likely not getting in with an equipment until later. But yeah, just an interesting decision by Greg.
Well, if you don't have either Hammer or Sigarda's Aid in your hand, there's not a combination of cards that you can draw in 1 turn that you could make Ornithopter 10-2. So there's really no reason, I think, to expose it to potential removal by playing it. All right. And we're going to see a Stoneforge now for Greg. Are we going to get a Shadow Spear? Are we going to get a Hammer? What are we feeling? Are we going to get a Reality Chip?
Interesting. Maybe really trying to take advantage of the mulligan on Mason's side. I think this is a bold This is a bold get from Greg, especially given we haven't seen a Sigarda's Aid or a Pure Steel in hand for that matter.
Yeah, I feel like Reality Chip is a card that's really strong when you're playing matchups that don't have a ton of interaction, and you can kind of go ham with a Reality Chip. But when you're playing against something that is going to have a lot of removal, I don't think it is one of the stronger gets that you can have with Stoneforge.
No, and Greg is actually flooding out a bit here. We just drew a silent clearing. So again, even on turn 3, Greg is sitting here with 4 lands in hand, an Ornithopter, and I want to say maybe a Springleaf Drum. So really no payoff to speak of. Or excuse me, no enabler. The hammer is in hand, but
And it looks like we have Drown in the Lock for Mason. We've got a Dress Down. Both relevant cards. So I feel like this Reality Chip might be eating a Drown in the Lock. But no, we're saving it.
yeah, I mean, you can. The Reality Chip's not really doing anything until Greg tries to equip it to something, or reconfigure, I suppose. So you can actually force Greg to commit the mana, and that's assuming obviously Mason's not trying to get a threat down here. If Mason's trying to actually like be mana efficient, get a threat down, then that's a different story. Maybe it is worth taking it out, but. And Greg taking advantage of Reality Chip's text that you can look at the top of your deck at any time.
I had a really fun time this past weekend playing Murktide against Hammer, where I got to cast a Reality Chip and then just always look at the top of my deck. It was very novel. It was amusing.
It's like having a bauble that you get always on yourself.
All right, we got a 1/1 Shadow here.
And this is all Mason really needs. I mean, so Mason goes to 5, but the hand is full of the elements that you're looking for. Mason's covered with the removal spells that are needed, and now we have a threat on board that can pretty quickly close out the game. And there's not too much danger to Mason to drop low to make the shadow big at the moment, given that Greg is not really presenting a very wide board or really any danger to Mason's life total. So we do see the Sigarda's Aid here.
And that Dress Down's pretty clutch for Mason because that's not a damage-based removal spell. So you don't have to worry about playing around the instant speed hammer.
And this gets pretty scary for Mason. I mean, Dress Down is obviously a great removal spell to have, but Greg can be a little bit cheeky here. Could potentially try to bait. Well, I guess the reconfigure cost is pretty high with it being 3 for the Reality Chip, so it'd be tough to bait that. I imagine if you're in Greg's position, you want to try and bait the reconfigure on the Ornithopter and then go for the kill with the Ink Moth Nexus.
Yeah, it makes sense if you're flooded. And we're going to have a fetch here for Mason. Perhaps a fetch shock to up the damage in the clock a little bit. Greg's a pretty healthy 18 right now.
The problem is, to do that, you need 6 mana, which is really, I mean, Greg is flooded, but we're not 6 mana flooded. I believe there's one more Ink Moth in hand, and then the Hammer are the only 2 cards that Greg has left. So we can get to 5, but with the reconfigure cost being 3, you can't activate Ink Moth and toss the Hammer on it.
All right, Greg taking 4 down to 14. Well, at this point, yeah. Is finding some way to bait a removal spell.
Ooh, there's a Pure Steel.
Okay.
That's big. So Pure Steel plus activate Ink Moth or toss the Hammer in play both give 3 artifacts. So I imagine that the line is to run out the Pure Steel first. Then I think I would just go to combat. I think I run out the Pure Steel, go to combat, swing with both Reality Chip and Ornithopter.
have a land drop to make as well.
I guess you're still going to likely lose one of the two. So here's the weird part. Okay, we're going to see the drown fired off.
Okay, do we have another drown in Mason's hand? I think we might. Maybe get a little hand cam action over there.
So how did we, oh, I see. We countered the pure steel rather than letting it resolve. That makes a lot of sense.
Right, we can't do the hand cam on the backup match. That's my bad. I was like telling producer Ian to be like, switch to the hand cam. It's like they're like 5 feet away from where the hand cams are. All right, that is the second drown in response to a hammer. Okay.
So why are we responding?
Because we made a mistake.
Yeah, so you need to drown this hammer then. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, at this point you need to just drown the hammer.
Yeah. Okay.
This is going to result, so...
I mean, that's. I feel like that was the correct to counter the hammer when pure steel. You have potential pure steel coming up. Is, you know, if Greg top decks that would be bad. So just, you know, having the hammer, if Greg tapping out and having the hammer not on the battlefield that makes sense. I can see that being the correct play.
Yeah, I think I would have waited until the hammer got equipped and then killed what it was equipped to, but yeah, this will work.
I think we might get the reconfigure with reality chip. And Greg still has, unless we can pump the shadow, a couple turns left.
This is a great backup match.
Oh, wow. Here we go. Land for turn. Now there is a saga in Greg's hand, but I think Greg realizing that we need to maximize the amount of cards we get off reality chip here.
Yep.
And, oh, that's a bummer. It's probably another land on top of the deck.
That's very likely. So here's the interesting thing about playing a blue version of Hammer versus like a mono white version. So in a mono white, you might be playing cards like Blacksmith Skill that you could potentially like cycle with a reality chip. But with a blue deck, you might actually be stuck with some sort of interaction like a Spell Pierce or a Mana Leak on top. Although since Dress Down resolved, I imagine that was not. It was the land. Hollowed Fountain on top. Unfortunate for Greg.
Yeah, that was well played by both parties there.
Wow, Mason with a TBR and some number of Murktides in the deck.
Sweet.
This is an interesting version of Grixis.
I like people being a little bit experimental.
Absolutely.
Because yeah, especially when you're playing like a known archetype, and then you also have some spice in there, like TBR. TBR are pretty similar to, in what it does, effectively similar to Dress Down. I think I do like the Dress Down better in the deck, just for the fact that it cycles. But yeah, I could see, Murktide folks have been playing around with that, being an alternative to a card like Kroxa. Yeah, it's interesting. It worked out for Mason there.
Yeah, interesting to see. So it looks like Mason brought in 2 copies of Terminate, or maybe there are 2 in the main deck. Maybe it looks like all of the iterations came out. Interesting.
Yeah, I feel like I very, very rarely. It looks like Kroxas came out.
That makes a lot of
sense. I very rarely, if ever, when I play an iteration deck, board those out. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like you can still, well, I guess it depends on how you want to play the matchup. If you want to actively remove things on the board, then you potentially have more time to expressive iteration and not die to one of Hammer's plays. But I can also see, I mean, this was an example of a game where Mason mulled to 5 and then just basically 1-for-1'd into a win. Granted, Greg had a probably worse than average by a decent margin hand there, getting flooded.
Yeah, I think Greg had a keepable hand, and it's really hard to mulligan if you have a hand that has the pieces, but it was very slow and a little bit land heavy, and then just ended up drawing a whole lot of lands that weren't Urza Saga until the end there.
Right, I think that's the danger, right? Is I believe the hand had payoffs but no enablers, and it feels like the deck is better able to get payoffs than enablers because it's only running 8 enablers and 4 pure steel and 4 Sigarda's Aid, but there's actually a lot of ways to search up the hammers themselves, be it Urza Saga, Stoneforge Mystic, drawing it naturally. Some decks are playing Steel Shaper's Gift.
I think that's a big difference between the mono white and the blue splashes. Mono white can play Steel Shapers, and blue splash is usually on Reality Chip plus some number of spell pierces on the sideboard. But we got almost a full 50 minutes there of modern paper content for you, and we're gonna bounce to our jam of a tune for a little bit of break, and we'll be back for round 2 here at Guardian Games in Portland, Oregon for Modern Mondays in just a minute.